Hey there, I'm Judith from Just You Designs and welcome to my little drawstring vintage bag tutorial. So I made a lot of these for gift bags over Christmas and had a lot of requests for a tutorial. So that's what I've done. I have videoed a tutorial on how to make this little style of drawstring bag, and it is patchworked front and back, and I use lots of little vintagey pieces and little pieces of embroidery and vintage lace. As you can see, they're hand quilted, and then I show you how to create the drawstring in the top as well. They're fully lined, so they make great reusable gift bags, and I hope you really enjoy my little tutorial. So the first thing we need to do with our little bags is create the top section, the little patchwork square section, and you need 15 squares per side in 3 rows of 5 2-inch squares that are cut. And you can see here I have used a mixture of, this was an embroidered tablecloth, little bit of embroidery onglet there. This was off a vintage, little fussy cut off a vintage apron. That was a wee embroidered duvet cover. And this was off a blouse. And this material is very thin, so I spray basted the back, sprayed it with starch on the back of it first and ironed it just to give it a little bit more stability. And then I've just mixed in some other little vintage or quilting, pieces of quilting cotton squares in with my repurposed bits and pieces. And you can see here that I have stacked all the squares in pairs. So I'm keeping the front and the back of my bag the same in terms of the patchwork squares, but you know, you could mix it up completely, in which case you would have a separate pile of 15 here and then your other 15 here. So we want to sew these together in rows, and you're using, I use a scant 1/4 inch seam, so you'll need a 1/4 inch foot on or your 1/4 inch or scant 1/4 inch needle position on your machine, neutral thread, and a nice fine needle for sewing these together, or a 70 or an 80. And we're just going to sew them in rows, and I'm going to do my front and back at the same time. Now when you have your squares joined into your 3 rows, we want to iron the seams, and we're going to take row 1 and row 3, we want to iron those in the same direction, and row 2 is going to go in the opposite direction. So I'll show you here on the back. This row and this row, the seams are lying in the same direction, going this way, and then this middle row, it's going the opposite way. And that's going to be useful for this next stage, where we're going to nest the little intersecting seams together. So you're going to put row 1 right sides together to row 2, and starting in one of your more central seams intersections, you want to nest the seams, and because we've ironed them in opposite directions, they'll just fit snugly together. You don't want them overlapping or with a gap in between, just sitting snug together. And then you can pin vertically in that seam, and just keep the tip a 1/4 inch away, more than a 1/4 inch away from the edge of where we're going to sew. And that means you can leave your pin in as you sew, and that's really going to anchor that little intersection and stop it from moving out of place when we sew the 2 edges together. So do this for all of your little intersections. It's worth taking the time over it to get very pleasing results, that all your little intersections are nesting together nicely. And then we want to sew your 1/4 inch or your scant 1/4 inch all the way down here Do take care though on the back. Sometimes if the seams are lying the opposite way to how you're sewing, they can flip back on you. So just remember to keep checking underneath that they're lying nice and flat. Okay, take pins out. Yeah, that looks good. So you can go ahead and add the bottom row on, and you're nesting and sewing, pinning and sewing in exactly the same way as the first 2 rows. And do check each time that you're actually getting those 2 seams just button up nicely against each other. There you go, that's our first half done, and you can either press your seams open. Oh, I've got a little flip-flop there. Okay, that's what I was telling you about earlier, where sometimes your seams can flip back on you. So if you just take literally 1 stitch out of that, flip it back the other way and just re-sew that little section, that'll sort that right out. So these 2 new seams, you can either press them open, or mine are wanting to go away from the center, so I might just press them the way that it wants to go there. So you want to repeat this process for the other half of your bag. So when you have your top panels pieced and pressed, you want to add on a base. And the base is 8 inches wide by 5 inches tall, and I'm using this Essex yarn dyed linen, which is 50% linen, 50% cotton. It's available in the shop. This is the colour flax, and it's a lovely textile to work with, because while it has the linen, all the look and the texture of the linen, it doesn't behave like linen when you're sewing with it. It's much more stable. And you may think that this base looks huge, disproportionate to the top half, but don't forget that we're going to be creating a base in the bottom of our bag, and that's going to eat into about 1.5 inches worth there. So we will absorb some of that. Now you can see here what I've done next after attaching my base is I've spray basted the panel to a piece of wadding, and just standard quilt wadding. This is Hobbs Premium Heirloom, which I also have available in the shop, and you can see here I've left it a tiny bit bigger than the size of the front and the back panels. And get those basted onto your wadding ready for quilting. Now you can machine quilt these if you wish. I like to do a little bit of hand quilting onto these little vintagey drawstring bags. I think it just adds a little bit more texture and character, and this wadding is lovely for hand quilting through as well. So I'm just going to echo all of the seams, the horizontal ones and the vertical ones, and then I might with red, I'll do that with white floss, and then maybe with a little bit of red I'll just do some little decorative stitches here and there. And then if you want to add in any little bits of lace or buttons or trim or whatever you want to decorate your bag, that's the time to do it after you have quilted them. So I've got my 2 quilted panels here. You can see that I've just done some little running stitches by hand, echoing the vertical and the horizontal seams, and I did a little bit of just tiny little bit of red stitching just as for interest, and I've also just hand stitched down a couple of little pieces of vintage lace in a couple of places, and a little bit of embroidery anglais attached with a button. So you decorate your panels and quilt them whatever way you like. And then as you can see here, I've trimmed back the excess bit of wadding, so I'm back to 8 by 9.5. Yeah, 8 by 9.5. So now we're ready to put the channels on the top, get those tacked down, and these are my channels. So let me talk you through what I have done with these. These are 1 3/4 inches wide by 8 inches across, which is the same width as your panels. And I've ironed under a little 1/4 of an inch and then another 1/4 of an inch at each short end, and then ironed the whole thing in half lengthways, wrong sides together. And I've done that for both of our channels. So what we're going to do now is we're going to center our channel on the top of our exterior pieces, and you should have around almost half an inch of free at each side here. Your channel shouldn't go all the way out to the edges, because we need to keep these little ends open to feed the drawstring cord into. Before I fix these down, tack these down, I'm just going to run a little stitch down close to the folded edge here on all 4 of these channels, and that just stops anything unraveling when we're putting the drawstring cord through them. So now I'm going to go ahead and pin my channel onto the exterior, leaving that all important half inch at each side, and I'm going to machine tack the top of the panel, and that's less than 1/4 of an inch with a nice big stitch. So there we go, that's it fixed, held in place. That will eventually be sitting up in the finished bag, but it's fixed with a machine tacking stitch, ready for the next bit. But before we go on to the next bit, I just want to get my other channel on. There we go. Now these panels are, as we said before, 8 by 9.5, so that is the cutting measurements for your lining. So even if you're varying the style of these drawstring bags, you may want a slightly taller one or a slightly wider one. Whatever your exterior panels end up as, those are the measurements that you cut your linings to. The construction method is the same regardless of what size panels that you are working to. Now before we put our linings in, we're going to match up our 2 exteriors, right sides together, and the important bit here really is where the 2 bases meet. You want to get that level. So pin those 2 first, and then you can pin the rest of the edges. Now we're going to sew, leave our top edge open. We're going to sew the 2 sides and the base edges. We're just going to use a standard 1/4 of an inch seam allowance here. You may want to increase your stitch length a little bit because we're going through 2 layers of fabric and 2 layers of wadding. And I did a little back stitch at the start and at the end there. So take our pins out, and if you need to, just check that you've got your alignment there of the base at the side before we go any further. So they're fine. So now what we're going to do is we're going to box the corners to create a base. So you need a square ruler, it doesn't have to be as small as this one. And what we're going to do is we're going to line up the 1.5 inch line with the outer edge of the wadding here. Draw a little box like that. You can just use a normal biro for this, and the same on the other side. And then we cut those out. Now, depending on what size of a base you want, you can make these squares bigger or smaller. The bigger obviously you make your squares at this stage, the more the base you create and the more you shorten the height of the bag. So a general rule of thumb is, while we measured 1.5 from the edge, we were 1 1/4 inch from the stitch line. So 2 1 1/4 inches is 2.5. So our base is going to be about 2.5 inches when it's sitting flat deep. So that's usually how you can sort of anticipate what size base you're going to have. So when we open up the corner and put the side seam on top of the bottom seam, we will now get 2.5 inches across, which is the width of this little square ruler. So you're essentially doubling whatever measurement you're creating from the stitches, you double that, and that will give you the depth of your base. But don't forget that the deeper you go, the shorter you're making the height. So we want to line up our side seam with our bottom seam, and you can use binding clips here or pins. Try and open your seams if you can. I know they're a bit thick, but we're going to sew across there 1/4 inch. Again, keep your stitch length up a little bit to get through all the layers. And I'm going to back stitch at the start and at the end. So that's one done, and then we do the same on the other side. And there's the base that's created, a 2.5 inch deep base, and if you flip it right sides out, poke out your corners nicely. You can see there's our 2.5 inch deep base, and it gives a nice little bit of body and shape to our drawstring bag. Now we can move on to our lining. So you can see here I have 2 pieces of lining that were cut the same size as my exteriors, 8 by 9.5. I've sewn the 2 sides 1/4 inch seam and part way along the bottom. So I've left a gap, couple of inches in the bottom edge, in the center of the bottom edge of the lining, and I have drawn on my box corners. So I'm going to, they're exactly the same size as the exterior ones, 1.5 inches from the outside edges of the fabric, or 1 1/4 inches in from the stitch line, and we're cutting those out. And if you have kept the gap in the middle of this bottom edge, you will have some stitches securing the edges of your box corners here. So in the same way as before, we open the fabric out, align the side seam with the bottom seam. This time I'm going to nest the seams. I'm not going to open them. I'm just going to nest them, so I'll push one way and one the other way and get them snug together. And then I can sew 1/4 inch across here as we did before. So pay attention to what direction you push the seam on the first box corner. So the bottom edge here, it's going this way, so I need to do the same on the other side, so that will eventually lie nice and flat. Okay, so there we have our little base in our lining. Now we can assemble the bag. So our exterior bag is right side out. We leave the lining wrong side out. We're going to put the exterior inside the lining. And the first thing we want to do is line up the side seams. So we'll get those nested and level at the top as well. I'm going to put a pin in here. And then the other side seam as well. and then you can pin the rest of the top edge and get everything nicely aligned there. And the two should fit exactly. So what we want to do now is we want to sew around this top edge 1/4 inch. You may want to take your accessories tray off your machine for this so that you can fit it in underneath more easily. And don't forget to increase your stitch length and back stitch at the start and at the end. Okay, there we go, all stitched around the top edge, and now we pull it through the gap in the lining. So we want to pull everything right side out, and you want to just check that everything's stitched in okay before we close up the gap in the lining. So just check that your channel is all nicely caught in. Yeah, that looks great. So you can either hand stitch the gap closed in your lining, or you can run a little machine stitch across it just really, really close to the edge, which is what I'm going to do. Okay, so that's our gap closed. We can push this down into the bag now. Get the corners pushed into the corners. Now we're going to do another row of stitching along here, and that helps to stop the lining from creeping up and keeps the channel sitting proud. If you want to iron this bit first, you can. Sometimes that helps just to settle all the fabric down before we do that line of stitching around it. I'm just going to go ahead and stitch it. So you're wanting nothing more than 1/4 inch, and you're sewing on the squares, not on the channel, but you want to be coming down no more than 1/4 inch below that seam. Okay, so that's what it looks like now. So it's nice and neat, and everything is sitting up nice and proud the way we want it to, and we've got our lining all pushed down nice and neatly inside. So the last thing left to do is to put our cord in. So I just use normal 1/4 inch piping cord. It comes in lots of different colours, and you measure the amount that you need. You need 2 lengths that are the same, and you're measuring it based on the bag being completely open. So if you put the curve at one edge, and then make sure you allow yourself enough to knot the fabric here, the cord here, so that when it's completely open, there's enough cord for it to expand completely open and the knot to come close to the edge. So that's where I'm going to cut, and I need 2 of those, so I can just measure the second one off the first one. That away. Right, now you need a safety pin, and we'll fix that to one end and start feeding our first length of cord in. I'm going right to left. So when you get to the end of the first channel, pull it a little bit, but don't pull it too far, and then carry on into the next channel. Keep going until you're right back at the start. Now if you have a nice wooden bead with a really big hole, this would be a lovely time to put it on before you knot. I don't have any, so I'm just going to knot the ends of my cord together. And you can see that when the bag is completely fully open, we've still got a little bit of room here. So our next length of cord goes in the opposite end. And there's enough room in our channel for 2 pieces of 1/4 inch piping cord. And there you have your finished drawstring bag. So you can fill it up with all your goodies and gift it to somebody as a reusable, cute vintage drawstring bag. I hope you had fun with my tutorial. If you'd like lots more inspiration, free tutorials, patterns and classes, do check out my website. You can also follow me on Instagram and Facebook.